The first thing I saw wasn't the house, the workshop, or the distant shimmer of the community pool. The first thing I saw as I guided 14 tons of advanced aerospace engineering over the final ridge was a splash of offensively bright cherry red parked directly on my welcome mat. Not the fibrous little mat by my front door that says, "Hope you brought coffee," but the giant concrete one with a big white H painted on it. A cherry red minivan, to be precise, parked so perfectly in the center of my helipad that you'd think they used a laser level. A vein in my temple, a vein I'd come to associate with my new life in the suburbs, began to throb a steady, rhythmic beat against my skull. "Orville," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "Identify the vehicle." "Scanning," a placid, synthesized voice replied in my headset. "Orville is my onboard AI. He's got the calm demeanor of a 1950s butler, which is exactly what you want when you're wrestling a half-plane, half-helicopter behemoth out of the sky." "Vehicle identified. 2018 Chrysler Pacifica. Color, velvet red pearl coat. Registered to one Brenda Miller, 142 Oak Haven Lane." I sighed. Of course it was Brenda. Brenda, the self-appointed guardian of neighborhood mediocrity. Brenda, who believed the Homeowners Association bylaws were a sacred text handed down from on high. "Any life signs, Orville?" "Negative, Alex. The vehicle is unoccupied. However, I am detecting a single life form, exhibiting elevated heart rate and smugness, in the adjacent property's garden." I zoomed in with the nose camera. There she was, pretending to prune a rose bush with all the horticultural finesse of a drunken badger. She glanced up, saw my Tiltrotor hanging in the air like a giant, angry dragonfly, and a tiny, triumphant smile touched her lips before she went back to mutilating the petals. She knew. She knew I was low on fuel from my Mojave trip. She knew diverting to the municipal airport was a colossal pain in the neck, involving fees, paperwork, and a 45-minute Uber ride. She was making a statement. This was a power play. This was also my home. And I was tired. My relationship with Brenda and her Praetorian Guard, the Oak Haven Estates HOA, hadn't started with a cherry-red declaration of war. It had started, as most suburban conflicts do, with a mailbox. I'd moved in 6 months prior. I'm an aerospace engineer. I design things that fly, and I'd sold a drone guidance system that finally gave me the capital to build my dream home. A modern cube of glass and steel with a massive workshop and, most importantly, enough land on the edge of the development for a personal helipad. It was all city approved, FAA cleared, and legally watertight before the first foundation pile was driven. I wanted to be able to fly from my workshop to test sites without ever touching civilian traffic. It was the ultimate expression of efficiency. A week after I moved in, I received my first formal communication. It was a crisp envelope with the Oak Haven HOA logo, an oak leaf that looked suspiciously like a Rorschach test. Inside, on thick cream-colored paper, was a violation notice. Violation: non-compliant mail receptacle. Bylaw 17, Section C, Paragraph 4. My mailbox was a sleek, minimalist piece of folded stainless steel I'd designed myself. It was weatherproof, theft-resistant, and, I thought, rather elegant. The notice went on to explain, in prose dripping with passive aggression, that it was not in keeping with the pre-approved rustic aesthetic of the community. Apparently, my options were classic barn-red postbox or faux stone pillar. I did what any reasonable engineer would do. I spent the next evening compiling a 10-page report on the superior wind resistance, material durability, and long-term cost-effectiveness of my design versus their flimsy, approved alternatives. I included metallurgical analysis and 3D stress test models. I printed it, put it in one of their pre-stamped reply envelopes, and sent it off. I never got a response, but my mailbox remained. I considered it a quiet victory. The quiet, however, was short-lived. A few days later, I was ambushed. I was walking back from my allegedly offensive mailbox when a woman with a helmet of blonde hair and the sharp, predatory eyes of a falcon intercepted me. "You must be Alex," she said. Her voice was sweet, but it had a steel edge, like a cupcake frosted with razor blades. "I am," I said cautiously. "I'm Brenda Miller. I'm the president of the Architectural Review Committee." She said, "Architectural Review Committee," like she was announcing her royal title. "We got your report very thorough." I try to be. She wasn't here to talk about mailboxes. Her eyes narrowed, flicking down to my driveway. "That gravel," she said, her nose wrinkling. "It's very aggressive." I looked at the gravel. It was gray. "It's rock," I said. "Crushed basalt, to be specific. The bylaws clearly state earth tones." "Is ballistic gray an earth tone, Alex?" I blinked. "It's the color of a significant portion of the Earth's crust, so yes, unless the part of the Earth you're familiar with is entirely beige, in which case I have geological questions." Her smile became a thin, bloodless line. "We'll be in touch," she said, before turning on her heel and marching away, her posture radiating indignation. The final straw before the Helipad incident was the poodle. I was in my workshop, a soundproofed marvel of modern engineering, calibrating a new type of sonic sensor. For exactly 30 seconds, it emitted a high-frequency pitch. It was barely audible to the human ear and well within daytime decibel limits as defined by city ordinance. 2 days later, another cream-colored envelope arrived. A formal noise complaint. According to the letter, signed by Brenda as head of the Neighborhood Serenity Subcommittee, my industrial-level acoustic disturbance had emotionally traumatized her toy poodle, Sir Reginald. The letter claimed the dog now required calming treats and extensive therapy. It demanded I cease all non-residential manufacturing activities immediately. I responded by sending the HOA board a copy of the City Noise Ordinance, a decibel reading from my property line during the test, and a gift certificate for a local dog groomer with a note that said, "For Sir Reginald's emotional distress. Hope this helps." That was a week ago, and now here she was, having escalated from passive-aggressive notes to using her minivan as a 2-ton paperweight on my landing pad. This wasn't about gravel or mailboxes anymore. This was a siege. Back in the cockpit of the Albatross, I took a deep breath. "Okay, Alex, let's be logical." "Orville, try hailing the Oakhaven security gate." "Hailing," Orville confirmed. A moment later, a youthful voice crackled through the speakers, barely audible over what sounded like a podcast about alien abductions. "Oakhaven Gate, this is Kevin." "Kevin, this is Alex from Lot 7. There's a vehicle parked on my helipad. I need it moved immediately so I can land." There was a long pause, filled with the muffled sounds of someone on the podcast describing a probing. Yeah, a car? On the, helicopter thingy? I don't know, man. Brenda came by earlier. She said not to bother you. Said you were handling a situation." "I'll handle a situation, all right. Kevin, this is an active landing zone. That vehicle is a hazard. I need you to send someone over right now." "Dude, I can't leave the gate. And Brenda's like the boss of the HOA. She signs my timesheets. I'm just gonna not get involved. Sorry." The line went dead. Useless, plan B. "Orville, call my landline." It rang and rang. No answer. Of course not. Brenda had waited until my housekeeper was gone for the day. She'd planned this. I had her number, saved in my phone under the contact, the Dragon. I had Orville dial it. Straight to voicemail. A chipper, pre-recorded Brenda informed me that she was unavailable to take my call right now. I could almost hear her silent, gloating laughter through the phone. Fine. Plan C. The Albatross is equipped with a warning horn, a polite but firm boop, designed to shoo birds off runways. I hovered at 500 feet, aimed my nose down, and gave it a short 2-second blast. Down on the ground, Brenda didn't even flinch. She just kept snipping at her roses, a picture of unbothered arrogance. My fuel gauge blinked. I had 20 minutes of hover time before I had to commit to diverting. 20 minutes before Brenda won. Diverting meant landing at the municipal airport, filling out a mountain of paperwork explaining why I'd deviated from my filed flight plan, paying a non-scheduled landing fee of $500, securing the Albatross for the night, and then calling an Uber for the long, humiliating ride home. All while she sat on her porch, sipping iced tea and basking in the glow of her victory. I looked at the clock on my dash. My patience wasn't measured in minutes anymore. It was measured in the throbbing of that vein in my temple. Every option, every logical, reasonable, and polite course of action had been exhausted. She had blocked them all. She had left me with only one path forward, the one she clearly didn't believe I would ever take. But here's the thing about engineers. We don't believe in unwinnable scenarios. We just believe in finding the right application of force. Okay, Brenda, I muttered to myself, my hands moving across the control panel. You want to play chicken with a 14-ton twin-rotor vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. You think your position on the Welcome Committee makes you immune to the laws of physics. I flicked a switch, and the low hum of the engines began to climb in pitch. But here's the thing about physics, Brenda. It doesn't care about your bylaws. It doesn't grade on a curve, and it's about to become your new next-door neighbor. I gripped the cyclic control stick. Orville, I commanded, my voice now as sharp and cold as polished steel. Set rotors to 75% power. We're landing on schedule. Rotors at 75%, Orville confirmed, his tone unchanging. Shall I cue up some appropriate music, Alex? A grin finally broke across my face. Orville, you read my mind. Put on Wagner. Ride of the Valkyries. As the triumphant, thunderous horns filled my headset, I began my descent. The landing was a symphony in 4 movements. Movement 1, the gentle breeze. At 200 feet, the initial effects of the downwash were subtle. Brenda's perfectly coiffed helmet of hair, which had likely survived a wind tunnel test at the salon, was instantly and unceremoniously demolished. Strands of blonde whipped across her face. She looked up, her smugness finally melting into confusion. A few loose leaves from her prize-winning Japanese maple, which had probably won some award for most pretentious foliage, began to skitter across her lawn. It was a mere whisper of what was to come, a polite warning. She ignored it, grabbing at her hair with one hand while holding her pruning shears like a weapon. Movement 2, the opening act. At 100 feet, the whispers became a roar. The meticulously arranged red mulch around her rose bushes, the volcano red she'd insisted was the only acceptable shade, atomized into a fine, brown-red mist, blasting outwards in a perfect circle. It coated the side of her beige stucco house in a layer of what looked like cinnamon dust. Her decorative garden gnome, a cheerful-looking fellow she called Mr. Wiggles, was lifted from his post by the invisible hand of my rotor wash and launched with surprising velocity over the white picket fence, tumbling end over end before disappearing into a hedge. The cherry-red minivan began to rock, gently at first, like a boat in a calm swell. Its sensitive alarm system, likely set to paranoid, let out a series of confused chirps. Beep, 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 beep. Brenda was no longer pruning. She was stumbling backward towards her porch, her face a mask of disbelief. Movement 3, the crescendo. At 50 feet, I unleashed a localized, man-made hurricane. The full, unadulterated fury of two 38-foot rotor discs spinning at several hundred RPMs descended upon Oakhaven Estates. The sound was immense, a physical presence that vibrated in your bones. Brenda had made it to her porch railing and was clinging to it for dear life, her mouth open in a scream that was utterly swallowed by the tempest. The minivan's alarm gave up on chirping and went into a full-throated, hysterical panic. The sheer force of the wind, a relentless column of air moving at over 100 miles per hour, began to peel at the vehicle. The cheap plastic hubcaps, designed to look like chrome but costing about 50 cents to produce, popped off their wheels with 4 distinct pings. They didn't fall. They were launched horizontally, spinning across the lawn like discus of death. One of them, a silver disc of shattered dreams, embedded itself deep into a slat of her picket fence with a sickening thwack. I could now hear Brenda's profanity, a string of creative and impressive curses that were somehow piercing the din. Through my cockpit window, I saw her prize-winning rose bushes, the ones that had won her a blue ribbon at the county fair, being systematically stripped of every leaf and petal. They were skeletal now, shivering in the wind, their denuded thorns looking like tiny, accusing fingers. Movement 4. Touchdown. This was the delicate part. I wasn't a monster. I was a surgeon. I didn't want to touch her car. I just wanted to re-educate it. I eased back on the collective, finessing the controls with millimeter precision. The Albatross settled towards the earth, its landing gear reaching for the concrete. I landed perfectly, not on her car, but on the available markings around it, my tires touching down with inches to spare. But the final blast of compressed air as 14 tons of aircraft settled was the coup de grace. The displaced air had nowhere to go but out. It slammed into the side of the minivan like a battering ram. The vehicle shuddered violently and slid sideways a few inches with a horrid screech of rubber on concrete. Then, with a resonant pop that was clear even over the engines, the driver's side window, unable to handle the sudden pressure change, imploded into a spiderweb of shattered safety glass. Then, silence. I shut down the engines. The great rotors spun down with a final, mournful whoosh. The sudden quiet was absolute, a vacuum broken only by the pathetic, dying wail of the minivan's car alarm and Brenda's ragged, incoherent gasps. I sat in the cockpit for a full 30 seconds, letting the silence wash over me. I took a long, slow sip from my water bottle. Then, and only then, did I allow myself a small, deeply satisfied smile. Mission accomplished. I unbuckled myself and initiated the shutdown sequence. The ramp at the back of the Albatross lowered with a hydraulic hiss. I walked down it, my flight tablet in hand, feeling as calm as a summer morning. Brenda did not look calm. She looked like she had just gone 10 rounds with a tornado and lost. Her hair was a wild, wind-swept mess. Her white cardigan was peppered with mulch and bits of leaf. Her face was pale, except for 2 bright spots of furious red on her cheeks. She saw me and stormed forward, her shoes squelching on her overly watered lawn. "You animal! You maniac!" she shrieked, pointing a trembling, dirt-caked finger at me. "Look what you did! You destroyed my car! You could have killed me!" I stopped a few feet away from her, just at the edge of my property line. "Brenda," I said, my voice level. "First, your car is not destroyed. It has suffered minor cosmetic and structural damage as a direct result of being parked in a hazardous location. Second, I was never closer than 50 feet to you, so the endangerment claim is a bit dramatic. And third," I held up my tablet, "your minivan was parked illegally, obstructing a federally registered private landing zone." "Bylaw 32 says guest parking is allowed on adjacent asphalt," she screeched. "This is reinforced concrete, not asphalt," I countered. And it's a helipad, not a guest parking spot. There's a rather large H on it. It's a subtle clue. Her sputtering was interrupted by the distant but rapidly approaching sound of sirens. I'd expected that. Someone, probably Brenda herself in a moment of panicked fury, had called the police. Good. I preferred to have witnesses. 2 cruisers from the local PD pulled up to the curb, their lights painting the scene in rhythmic flashes of red and blue. Out stepped 2 officers. The first was a man in his 50s with tired eyes and a mustache that had seen too much. His name tag read Miller. The second was a rookie, barely out of his teens, with wide, starstruck eyes. His name tag read Davis. Davis wasn't looking at us. He was staring, open-mouthed, at the albatross. "Whoa," Davis breathed. "Is that an Osprey?" "It's a V-22 class Tiltrotor, yes," I said. "Heavily modified." Miller ignored the hardware. His gaze was fixed on the scene. The weeping woman, the calm man, the damaged minivan sitting forlornly on a helipad. He sighed the deep, weary sigh of a man who was desperately close to retirement. "All right," he said, addressing the sky more than anyone. "What fresh madness is this?" Brenda immediately launched into her performance. "Officer, thank God you're here. This lunatic! He flew his war machine right at me. He tried to blow up my car. I have been harassed, intimidated. My property is destroyed. My poodle is traumatized. Arrest him!" Officer Miller let her rant for a solid minute, his expression unchanging. When she finally paused to take a breath, he turned his tired eyes to me. "Sir, your side of the story?" I waited a beat, letting the silence hang. Then I began, calmly and logically. "Officer, my name is Alex. This is my property. That helipad is a registered private aircraft landing zone, fully compliant with all city and FAA regulations. I have the paperwork right here." I tapped my tablet. I was returning from a business trip. My approach was standard. I saw the unauthorized vehicle obstructing my landing area. As per protocol, I attempted to make contact. I started ticking points off on my fingers. 1. I radioed Oak Haven Security. The guard on duty, a young man named Kevin, informed me that he had been instructed by Mrs. Miller not to intervene. I have the audio recording of that call. Brenda went pale. 2. I attempted to call the landline to my house with no answer. I then attempted to call Mrs. Miller's personal cell phone, which went directly to voicemail. I have the call logs. Brenda's mouth opened and closed like a fish. 3. I gave a standard audible warning signal from the aircraft. There was no response. The vehicle was not moved. 4. My fuel state necessitated a landing. Diverting would have been an unnecessary risk and expense caused by a deliberately created obstruction. Therefore, I made the decision, as pilot in command, to execute a landing in the safest manner possible, which I did without making any contact with her vehicle. I swiped on my tablet. I also have 4K video footage of the entire approach and landing, recorded from 3 different angles on the aircraft. You can clearly see her vehicle parked illegally, and you can also see that my landing was controlled and precise. The subsequent wind damage was an unfortunate but direct consequence of her actions. I looked at Officer Davis, who was still gawking at the albatross. "Officer Davis, you have a smartphone?" Yes, sir," he stammered. "I can airdrop you the video file." "That would be awesome," Davis said, before catching a withering glare from Miller. "I mean, for evidence, sir?" I sent the file. He watched it, his eyes going wide. A grin fought its way onto his face, and he had to turn away, pretending to cough. Miller pinched the bridge of his nose. He walked over to the minivan, looked at the shattered window, the embedded hubcap in the fence, the mulch-dusted house. He looked at Brenda, who was now vibrating with silent rage. He looked at me, standing calmly with my tablet of evidence. "Ma'am," Miller said, his voice flat, "is this your vehicle?" Yes, and he destroyed it. Ma'am, you parked your car on a helicopter landing pad. It wasn't a question. It was a statement about his noise pollution, she tried. Miller ignored her. Not only are you illegally parked on private property, but by doing so, you deliberately interfered with the operation of an aircraft. That's not just a local ordinance issue. That gets into federal territory. We could call the FAA right now if you'd like. They have very strong opinions about things like this. The last bit of fight went out of Brenda. The word federal seemed to suck the air right out of her. Now, Miller continued, pulling out his ticket book, I'm going to write you a citation for parking in a restricted zone. And since the damage to your window was a direct result of your vehicle being where it shouldn't have been, that's on you. I suggest you call a tow truck and your insurance agent, and I strongly suggest you move your vehicle before the property owner decides to press charges for reckless endangerment. He handed her the ticket. She stared at it like it was a venomous snake. As the officers prepared to leave, Miller walked over to me. Try to keep the peace, sir, he said, his voice low. He couldn't quite hide the glimmer of amusement in his tired eyes. Nice landing, by the way. Davis, walking past, gave me a quick thumbs up and a conspiratorial wink. That rotor wash is no joke, man, he whispered. They drove off, leaving me standing on my property and Brenda standing on hers, holding a pink slip of paper next to her battered, mulch-covered minivan. I had won the battle. But looking at the venomous glare she shot me before storming into her house, I knew the war was just beginning. That night I sat in my office, looking out at the silhouette of the albatross on the pad. Brenda was a creature of escalation. A ticket and a broken window wouldn't stop her. She'd see it as a flesh wound. She would retaliate with the only weapon she had, the HOA bylaws, wielded with the precision of a death by 1,000 paper cuts. Winning wasn't enough. I needed to build a permanent, unassailable defense. I needed to harden the target. I needed to send a message so clear, so overwhelming, that it would be the final word in our little dispute. This was no longer about a place to park my aircraft. It was about principle. It was about logic versus lunacy. And if I was being completely honest with myself, it was now about a little bit of spite. The next morning I made a call. An hour later, a large pickup truck that looked like it could tow a tank pulled into my driveway. Out stepped a man named Frank. Frank was built like a shipping container, with a huge grizzled beard and hands the size of dinner plates. He ran a high-end construction and security firm that normally worked on corporate campuses and panic rooms for billionaires. I led him to my back patio, which overlooked the helipad. "Frank," I said, "I have a project for you." "I like projects," he rumbled, his eyes scanning my property. "I want to make some upgrades. Let's call it Operation Fortress of Solitude." Frank listened, his expression as unreadable as a block of granite as I laid out my plans. "First," I said, pointing to the helipad, "the hangar. I'm thinking semi-subterranean. It rises out of the ground on a hydraulic lift. State-of-the-art. And soundproofed, obviously." I gave him a pointed look. "Completely soundproofed." Frank nodded slowly. "Hydraulic lift? Got it?" "Second, the helipad itself. I want it resurfaced with reinforced high-strength concrete, and I want military-grade LED landing lights embedded directly into the surface, the brightest ones you can legally source, for, safety in low-visibility conditions." "Safety," Frank repeated, a faint glint in his eye. "Third, perimeter security. I want a tasteful but formidable 8-foot wrought iron fence around the entire property line, automated gate, the works, to keep out stray animals." I glanced meaningfully toward Brenda's house. "Animals!" Frank grunted. Finally, landscaping. A dense, unbroken line of very tall, very fast-growing Leyland cypress trees along this entire property line here. I traced a line in the air between my yard and Brenda's. For privacy. Frank was silent for a long moment, stroking his beard. So, a soundproofed pop-up hangar, a reinforced landing pad with airfield-grade lighting, a security fence, and a biological wall, he summarized. Any other custom requirements? Just one, I said, leaning in conspiratorially. The new landing lights, the ones embedded in the pad. Can we make sure the primary navigation strobes have a secondary function? A user-activated mode. Let's call it Neighborhood Watch Illumination. Nothing aggressive, just a gentle, pulsating, intensely bright white glow. Pointed slightly upwards for deterring low-flying birds at night. For the first time, Frank's stony expression cracked. A slow grin spread across his face, revealing a gold tooth. "Mr. A," he said, clapping a hand on my shoulder that nearly sent me through the floor. "I think we can engineer a custom solution for your avian problem." Work began 2 days later. The arrival of an excavator and a fleet of construction vehicles sent a ripple through the quiet cul-de-sac. The sight of a massive hole being dug in my yard, the future site of the albatross's subterranean lair, seemed to cause Brenda physical pain. And so the paper-cut war began. Brenda's counteroffensive was swift and furious. My mailbox was flooded with certified letters from the Oak Haven HOA. It became a morning ritual. I'd sip my coffee and read her latest salvo with a kind of detached amusement. The first letter was a cease and desist order for the construction noise. I had my newly hired HOA specialist lawyer, a sharp, terrifyingly efficient woman named Miss Davenport, reply with a copy of my city-approved construction permit, which allowed for noise between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. She highlighted the relevant passage in yellow. The next was a violation notice for the fence design. Wrought iron is not a pre-approved material and creates a gated and hostile atmosphere. Miss Davenport replied with a copy of the original development plan from 2005, which I had dug up in the county records. It showed wrought iron as an approved fencing material, a clause Brenda's new board had conveniently forgotten to include in their updated bylaws. Then came the letter about the trees. Leyland cypresses are a non-native invasive species that will disrupt the local ecosystem. Miss Davenport, who was clearly enjoying herself now, replied with a letter from the nursery and a signed affidavit from a botanist confirming that the trees were a sterile hybrid incapable of spreading. She also included a helpful article on the benefits of trees for noise abatement. Brenda tried to rally the neighbors, going door to door with a clipboard and a story about how my industrial complex was destroying property values. It backfired spectacularly. Years of her petty tyranny had worn everyone down. A few brave souls even started visiting me under the cover of dusk, bringing offerings of beer and stories of their own. One guy, Bill from 2 houses down, told me she'd tried to fine him because his welcome mat said howdy instead of welcome. Another neighbor had been cited because their garden hose wasn't coiled in a clockwise direction. They saw my construction not as a threat, but as a glorious, well-funded rebellion. The final showdown was set for the annual HOA board meeting, held in the dismal, beige-carpeted community clubhouse. Brenda, as president, had placed an emergency item on the agenda, a motion for the immediate and forceful removal of the illegal private airfield at Lot 7. I arrived with Miss Davenport, both of us dressed in sharp business attire. Brenda and her 2 board cronies were at a folding table at the front, looking smug. She had a rickety projector set up, displaying the title of a PowerPoint presentation she'd clearly made herself in word art, Protecting Our Community. When the floor was opened for her agenda item, she launched into a dramatic, tearful speech about peace, serenity, and the monstrous flying machine that was threatening their way of life. She clicked to her next slide, a blurry photo of my house with a big red circle and a question mark over it. When she finished, to a smattering of polite, uncertain applause, the interim chairman turned to me. "Mr. A, do you have a rebuttal?" "I do," I said, standing up. Miss Davenport handed me a remote. "Brenda, that's a lovely presentation, but the font is a bit dated. Allow me." I clicked the remote. Brenda's presentation vanished, replaced by my own. The projector, now connected to my laptop, displayed a crisp, clean title slide on the screen. Oakhaven Estates, a study in petty tyranny. A gasp went through the room. Brenda turned beet red. "I moved here 6 months ago," I began, my voice calm and clear. "In that time, I have tried to be a good neighbor, but my attempts at peaceful coexistence have been met with a targeted campaign of harassment. Let's look at the data." Click. The next slide appeared. It was a clean bar chart. HOA violations received past 180 days. My bar, labeled Alex, soared to the top with a value of 27. The bar next to it, labeled Average Oakhaven Resident, barely registered at 1.2. Click. Incident, May 15th. The 4K video from the Albatross filled the screen. We all watched the cherry-red minivan sitting on the helipad. I paused on a perfect close-up of Brenda in her garden, glancing up at me with that smug little smile. As you can see, this was not an accident. This was a deliberate provocation. I let the video play, the music of the Valkyries now softly filling the clubhouse. The hubcaps flying off drew an audible titter from the audience. The window shattering got a round of applause from Bill in the back. Click. A question of compliance. The next slide was a map of the neighborhood. 15 little red flags were dotted around the map. In the process of defending myself, my lawyer and I did a little architectural review of our own. These flags represent HOA violations. I clicked again, and photos appeared next to the flags. For example, the fence at 142 Oakhaven Lane is 2 inches above the regulation height. The unapproved volcano red mulch. The unapproved rose varietals. They were all pictures of Brenda's house. Brenda was on her feet, shouting, "This is an outrage! This is a personal attack!" "No, Brenda," I said, my voice cutting through hers. "This is evidence." Miss Davenport stood up. "In light of this pattern of targeted harassment, abuse of power, and clear hypocrisy," she announced in a voice that could chip granite, "we are formally putting forth a motion of no confidence in Brenda Miller's leadership. Furthermore, we are moving to recall her from the HOA board, effective immediately, as per the rights granted in Bylaw 61, paragraph F." The room, which had been simmering, erupted. It was a revolution in beige. One by one, my neighbors stood up. Bill talked about the howdy mat. A woman in the front row detailed her multi-year battle over the color of her wind chimes. It turned out that nearly everyone in the room had a Brenda story. She had ruled by fear, and now the fear was gone. The vote wasn't even close. It was a landslide. Brenda was dethroned, not with a bang, but with a sea of raised hands in a stuffy clubhouse. She gathered her things in a daze and slunk out the back door without another word. A month later, the world was a different place. The fence was up, the cypress trees were taking root, and the hangar was complete. From the street, you couldn't even tell it was there. My lawn just looked a little steeper. I was sitting on my back patio, sipping a cold beer and watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. The neighborhood was quiet, genuinely quiet. The only sound was the chirp of actual crickets, not the imagined screams of a traumatized poodle. I heard footsteps on the gravel path. It was Bill holding a six-pack. "Hey, Alex," he said, handing me a bottle. "Thought you might be thirsty after, all the civic engagement." I laughed, taking the beer. Thanks, Bill. It's been a process. He settled into the chair next to me, looking out at the perfectly clean, unobstructed, and now gloriously over-engineered helipad. The embedded lights were off, but I knew they were there, waiting. So, he said, a grin spreading across his face. The big question, the one everyone's been asking. What's that? When are you gonna take me for a ride in that thing? I looked at the ramp to the subterranean hangar, a sleek gray line in the manicured grass. I looked at the peaceful sky, and I smiled. How's Saturday?